Situated across from downtown Chicago is Northerly Island, a man-made island consisting mostly of park space on land that was dredged up from the bottom of Lake Michigan in 1925. This island was originally conceived as the northernmost, hence its name Northerly, of a series of island parks. It turned out to be the only such island built. Less than 100 years ago, Northerly Island looked very much different than it does today. For 2 years, 1933 to 1934, with an adjacent section of the mainland, Northerly Island formed a sprawling fairgrounds. Exciting visions of brightly colored modern buildings and attractions of all kinds greeted the viewer. There was the Sky Ride, a giant transport bridge between the mainland and the island. Its two 628-foot towers supported cables along which ran double-decker rocket cars carrying visitors 200 feet in the air. And there were airplanes, blimps, balloons, and dirigibles, either on the ground or flying overhead. It was Chicago's Century of Progress Exposition, a remarkable World's Fair held in the middle of the Great Depression. In all, nearly 40 million people visited to see and marvel at the sights and sounds. Initially, the intent of the fair's planners was to celebrate the centenary of the founding of the city of Chicago by highlighting the city's first 100 years in a historical retrospective. As plans matured, however, the primary theme of the fair became the advancements of mankind through science, making it a showcase for modern living, consumerism, and entertainment. In keeping with the fair's theme, several consequential aviation events and displays were mounted. These and their philatelic aspects are the subject of this current presentation. It won't be possible to cover everything in one outing, so my comments are divided into 2 sessions. The most elaborate aerial visit to the Century of Progress was by the Italian air crews of 24 seaplanes that involved a double crossing of the North Atlantic, a remarkable feat for the aircraft of the day. Its leader and principal planner was General Italo Balbo, by that time a famous aviator and a popular figure among Italians everywhere. Balbo was an ardent fascist and close associate of Mussolini. Through his organizational abilities and his interest in aviation, Balbo became Minister of the Air Force in 1929. In the next few years, he set out to improve Italian military and commercial aviation and staged public aviation demonstrations that would increase the prestige of Italy and the Italian Fascist Party. Contrary to the other prominent Italian flyers of the period, who made single-plane flights, General Balbo developed the idea of mass flights involving multiple aircraft flying in formation. He reasoned that such flights had a more impressive effect both on the airmen involved and the people who saw them. In 1928 to 29, he made 2 mass flights in the Mediterranean. In 1930 to 31, he made a transatlantic air cruise from Rome across the South Atlantic to Rio de Janeiro. Immediately following the trip of 1930 to 31, Balbo conceived an even more ambitious transatlantic cruise for 1932. The Decennial Air Cruise, as it was called, was intended to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Italian fascists coming to power. Technical problems made it necessary to delay the trip until 1933, but it turned out to be fortuitous. Taking place in 1933 enabled the air cruise to mark the 10th anniversary of the Italian fascists, albeit a year late, to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the founding of the Royal Italian Air Force, and to visit the World's Fair in Chicago. In the first 3 Italian air cruises, the men and planes returned by ship. But the fourth air cruise was to be a round trip involving an ambitious double crossing of the North Atlantic to America. The aircraft for the 1933 air cruise was the Savoia Marchetti SM-55X, a longer-range modification of a successful double-hull seaplane design introduced in 1926 and used on Balbo's three previous air cruises. Balbo's historic trip began with 25 planes taking off from the seaplane base at Orbitello, Italy, near Rome, on July 1st. Their first leg took them over the Alps to Amsterdam, where one of their planes was lost in a landing accident. The following day, the Armada began a stepwise journey across the Atlantic via Londonderry, Ireland, and Reykjavik, Iceland, to Sandwich Bay at Cartwright, Labrador. Next, the planes flew to Shediac, New Brunswick, then to Montreal, and finally to Chicago. Balbo had expected that his crossing would be more rapid, but they lost days waiting for the inclement weather in the Atlantic to clear so they could fly. In the early evening of July 15th, huge crowds lined the Lake Michigan shoreline to get a glimpse of the Italian flyers. In a carefully choreographed maneuver, the formation flew past the fairgrounds, swung back into the wind, and landed one plane at a time, with Balbo's plane first. It made a perfect landing, which was recorded by movie cameras. Once on the ground, Balbo and his men were transported to the fairgrounds for an hour's visit, and then to Soldier Field on the mainland across from the north end of Northerly Island, where Mayor Edward Kelly welcomed them before an audience of some 100,000 people. Kelly proclaimed the day Italo Balbo Day and announced that Chicago's 7th Avenue was to be renamed Balbo Avenue, a name that still stands today. The return trip to Rome began on July 19th with a flight to New York, where the Armada was greeted by the USS Macon and about 100 planes. Balbo's squadron landed at the Floyd Bennett seaplane base at the tip of Coney Island. From New York, the Armada flew to Shediac, New Brunswick on July 25th and on to Shoal Harbor at Clarenville, Newfoundland the next day. From there, the intention was to fly a northern route to Ireland and on to France and then Rome. But once again, the aviators found themselves frustrated by bad weather in the Atlantic. Finally, Balbo chose a more southerly route through the Azores and Lisbon. On August 12th, Balbo and his men made the final flight from Lisbon to Rome. The waiting crowds included Mussolini and the royal family. The success of the trip added to Balbo's popularity at home, but it came at a cost. Benito Mussolini was by nature a jealous and insecure person. Balbo was already the heir apparent to the leadership of the Italian Fascist Party, and he was sometimes quite vocal in his opposition to some of Mussolini's ideas. So just a few months later, Mussolini appointed Balbo Governor-General of Libya in North Africa. That effectively removed him from the center of political power and made him less of a threat to Mussolini. Balbo lived out the rest of his life in Libya, perishing there when his plane was mistaken for an enemy and shot down early in World War II. The philatelic programs associated with Balbo's Century of Progress trip were as ambitious as the flight. The Italian program was the most extensive. Special airmail stamps, all designed by General Balbo, were issued for Italy and the colonies of the Aegean Islands, Cyrenaica, and Tripolitania. The airmail stamps for Italy and the Aegean Islands were of two values: 25 lira for destinations in Europe, including Iceland, and 50 lira for the United States and Canada. Each is a three-section stamp or triptych. The left-hand section is a label with the Italian flag. The center section is a 5.25 lira stamp bearing a portrait of King Victor Emmanuel III, and the right-hand section is either a 19.75 or 44.75 lira stamp. The 5.25 lira portion paid the rate for an ordinary registered letter by express mail, and the 19.75 or 44.75 lira portion paid the supplementary rate for the special flight. The design on the right-hand panel of the 19.75 lira carries mythic figures and the armada of aircraft in flight. On the right-hand panel of the 44.75 lira stamp is a rendering of the Roman Colosseum with the armada flying across toward the skyscrapers of Chicago. The frame colors are distinctive for each value. On the 25 lira, the label and the 19.75 lira frames are red, and the 5.25 lira frame is green. Vice versa for the 50 lira stamp. The triptych stamps were to have three different uses: for general Italian dispatches, for official dispatches, and for covers sent from the Aegean Islands. The basic design and frame colors are the same, except the vignettes are of different colors: ultramarine for general Italian, red-violet for officials, and blue-gray for Aegean Islands, and each type has a distinguishing black overprint. On the 25 and 50 lira stamps for general Italian dispatches, the label is printed Apparecchio, meaning aircraft, below which is the identification code for one of the designated mail-carrying aircraft. The 20 identification codes consist of I- for Italy, followed by 4 letters based on the pilot's last name. On the official stamps, Servizio di Stato is overprinted on both the label and the 44.75 lira stamp. Only the 50 lira value was required for the official stamp because its intended purpose was to allow mayors in Italian cities to send greetings to the mayor of Chicago. And on the 25 and 50 lira stamps for the Aegean Islands, the overprint is Isole Italiane dell'Egeo. The stamps for Cyrenaica and Tripolitania, which at the time were separate colonies but later became part of Libya, are conventional style single 19.75 and 44.75 lira stamps, with vignette designs unique to each colony. Since the stamp value failed to include the registered express fee of 5.25 lira, that amount was added to the covers in regular stamps. All the varieties of the Italian imperial and colonial stamps were valid only for the trip, and the unissued remainders were returned to the post offices in Rome immediately after the planes departed for Amsterdam. To accommodate mail for cruise covers dispatched from Iceland, the Icelandic government overprinted regular issue 1, 5, and 10 krona stamps of the 1930-31 issue. The red overprint reads Hopeflug Itala, 1933, in 2 lines. The 3 values made up the 16 krona rate to America, to which 30 had to be added for regular postage. On the return trip, the Newfoundland government negotiated with General Balbo to carry covers to Rome bearing a specially overprinted Newfoundland airmail stamp. The government overprinted 8,000 of the 1933 issue 75-cent airmail stamps, 1933 Gen. Balbo Flight $4.50 in black in 4 lines. This price made the Newfoundland stamp the most expensive stamp of the cruise. The high price was the result of Balbo's demands. Of the $4.50 selling price, the Italians received $3.75, and the Newfoundland government received only 75 cents. Collectors winced at the high price of the Newfoundland Balbo stamp, but they all sold. However, only a small fraction of the stamps saw use on covers, leaving the majority unused. Most of the covers carried by the Italian air fleet were inbound covers from Italy, bearing the triptych stamps. They were addressed to stops along the inbound route, as well as New York and Shoal Harbor, Newfoundland, along the return route. Each was stamped with the small Italian trip cachet in blue or green. The example shown here was carried from Rome to Chicago. The triptych stamp has the I Tucci overprint, indicating that Captain Giuseppe Tucci's plane carried the cover. This is an example of one of the colonial covers from Tripolitania, flown on the inbound trip to Chicago. It carries the appropriate 50 lira postage, 44.75 lira Tripolitania special stamp, and 5.25 lira in regular Libyan stamps, and has the Italian flight cachet in green at the lower left. Several dispatchers of mail to the inbound flight used their regular stamps for franking. One was the Vatican. Their covers were franked with 25 lira in either Vatican stamps or a combination of Vatican and Italian stamps. And from Amsterdam, a modest number of covers bearing Dutch stamps was sent. Another group of dispatches that used regular stamps for franking arrived in Rome too late to be placed on the air tour planes there. By special arrangement, the covers were flown separately from Rome to Londonderry to catch up with the air tour. These covers were mostly Italian, franked with regular Italian stamps, not the triptychs, but the group included a few covers from Germany, franked with German stamps. Both stops in Canada on the inbound flight contributed covers franked with regular Canadian stamps. In addition, the International Airmail Society appears to have convinced Balbo to carry several hundred unusual covers from Montreal to Chicago, with their cachet and franked with only 8 cents instead of the normal $1.50 postage. Decennial cruise covers posted in the United States for the return trip to Italy were franked with regular American stamps and usually received a large American flight cachet in magenta or black before departure and a small Italian cachet upon arrival in Rome for those that went that far. The first cover in this slide went from Chicago to Rome and is franked with $3.70. The Italian cachet is in green and the American cachet is in black. The second cover in this slide is for the return from New York to Newfoundland. The postage paid is $1.70 and the magenta American flight cachet for New York to Rome is in the center. Covers sent from Canada and Newfoundland received no dispatch cachet, but were given the Italian flight cachet when they arrived in Rome. The Canadian covers were franked with regular Canadian stamps, and the Newfoundland covers received the special overprinted Newfoundland airmail stamp. Balbo hoped that the Italian stamp sales would be great enough to pay the cost of the Chicago trip, but he was wrong. The creation of so many varieties, resulting from the use of the aircraft identification letter overprints on the triptychs, created hardship for many trying to maintain their stamp collections in difficult economic times. Stamp sales did not go well. Part of the remainders were distributed among the aviators, and the rest were sold at a discount. Today it is still possible to buy full panes of some varieties. In the early 1930s, several countries were in competition to make ever higher balloon ascents into the stratosphere for scientific purposes. In Belgium, the Picard brothers, Auguste and Jean, were famous for their ballooning exploits. So the organizers of the Century of Progress decided that a stratosphere flight attempt from the grounds of the Chicago World's Fair by Auguste Picard, the most famous of the siblings, would be well received. Auguste was unable to come, so his brother Jean came instead. The balloon was to be co-piloted by Picard and an American naval officer, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Tex F.M. Settle. Professor Arthur H. Compton from the University of Chicago was named the flight's director of science, and he provided instruments for studying atmospheric cosmic rays and ozone. Thus the flight was officially called the Picard-Compton Stratosphere Ascension from Soldier Field. In honor of the fair, the balloon was named Century of Progress. Late in the preparations, it was realized that Picard did not have a U.S. balloon pilot's license, and Settle became the sole pilot. The Century of Progress's gondola was made of Dow metal, an alloy containing primarily magnesium. On August 4th, the Century of Progress was inflated with hydrogen while some 40,000 spectators watched. It took off at 3 a.m. the next morning. Unfortunately, a valve rope got hung up in the pleats of the balloon's fabric, leaving a gas release valve open and forcing Settle to abort the flight. Within an hour, the balloon was back on Earth, just a mile from its launching point, and the mission was a failure. 3 months later, Lieutenant Commander Settle and Marine Major Chester Fordney, flying the Century of Progress from Akron, Ohio, made an altitude mark of 61,237 feet. To the best of my knowledge, there were no covers carried in the gondola of the Century of Progress balloon, but there were numerous private commemorative covers postmarked August 5th to mark the brief flight. This concludes Part 1. In Part 2, we'll cover the visits by the dirigibles Graf Zeppelin and USS Macon, the Adams non-stop airmail pickup and delivery demonstrations, and some other miscellaneous topics. Thank you.